We're going to go on now to a pre-recorded video from Kajsa Ekis Ekman from Sweden. So Kajsa Ekis Ekman, thank you so much for coming to talk to Women's Human Rights Campaign on our FQT, Feminist Question Time panel. Kajsa is a journalist, writer and activist, author of 4 books, among them Being and Being Bought, Prostitution, Surrogacy and the Split Self. Kajsa's most recent book, published in Swedish, On the Meaning of Sex, Thoughts on the New Definition of Woman, is just out. Was it out last week, Kajsa?
Last month, so it's been out a month.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're really pleased to welcome you on today to tell us about the book and what you've found out and what you've learned.
Well, my new book is about the new definition of sex that's taken hold in the Western world. And I'm trying to map it out, like, what is this change? What is it in ideological terms? What does it mean? What's the historical backdrop and what consequences does it have? So basically, the new definition of sex is about reversing sex and gender. As you know, we always used to say, well, you know, sex is innate, that's what you're born with, it's just innocent, you know, it's not the cause of patriarchy, sex is just there. Whereas everything that was a social construct, gender roles, you know, the wage gap, all that stuff we used to call gender. And we said, well, gender you can change, right? I mean, gender isn't the same in history. Like, there have been cultures where men have had long hair, there have been matriarchies, you know, gender is not innate. Gender doesn't come with sex, right? So now we have this new definition according to which, you know, sex doesn't really exist, right? Sex is just a social construct, we're told, whereas gender is innate. Yeah. So practically you're born with your gender. Are you born with your gender role? Which now has been renamed gender identity, which we're told is something completely different. Whereas when it's been explained, it turns out it's basically the same gender roles again.
Yeah, and so what do you have an idea, or do you explain when this reversal happened and where it happened? I know you focused on mostly Sweden or a global reach.
My book is global because this is something that happens particularly in the advanced capitalist industrialized countries. You know, we don't really see it in the countryside of like, you know, a third world country. We don't really see it, although it's coming in through the law mainly and through harmonization of different laws in different countries. But the way I see it is, I mean, there's a lot of factors here, you know, because it has a lot of consequences for different groups. You know, there are consequences mainly for 3 groups. I would say for women, for homosexuals, and for young people with gender dysphoria. So these are the most affected groups in different ways. And I would say when it comes to women, if you look at historical texts for about 2,000 years and you search for the word woman in there, you're going to find that, first of all, it's something that men define what it is. And second of all, it's something that men don't really like very much, because often when this word appears, it's about how inferior a woman is by nature, that does she have a soul or doesn't she have a soul? You know, is she not as complete in her biology as man? I mean, religious texts, scientific, philosophical, you name it. Then you have about 200 or so years ago, all of a sudden, woman is starting to take on a new meaning in historical texts. And you have women themselves defining what a woman is and fighting back and writing, you know, work after work on what a woman is. So when you get to today, you have a definition of woman, not as an inferior being, but as a politically oppressed subject with a right to protest and a right to fight for herself. So this is the meaning that woman has acquired today. What does that tell us? Well, that tells us that woman is no longer a tool in patriarchy's toolbox. It's not useful. So what happens is they do away with it. Woman as a word is not needed. So all of a sudden we're told that woman is a problematic word. that who knows what is a woman. Woman as a word is being fragmented, it's being cut up, it's being made taboo in a lot of ways. So all of a sudden, it's difficult for us to use that word anymore. Now, if we don't have that word as an entity, we can no longer have a women's movement. We can't even talk about fighting for our rights because we're being cut up into vulva havers, uterus bearers, menstruators, and cis women and whatnot.
Yeah, and we can't speak for ourselves. That's another thing. I think, like you say, for those 200 years when we started to have a voice and say what we want, we can have men now speaking for us, which seems to be more and more the case. Yeah, and we're being fragmented. So those consequences are massive for women. And you said there are 3 groups who are in your sort of reading of it, or your writing. There are consequences for women, and also what are the consequences then for homosexuals and young people?
Well, basically, if you look at studies regarding the group that's being taken to medical treatment for gender dysphoria, or as it's now going to be called, gender incongruence, which actually is a definition that's even worse, because gender dysphoria at least entailed the criteria that was you had to be suffering. So basically this treatment was supposed to alleviate your suffering. Now that's been taken away in the new definition of gender incongruence. So now it's only about basically what you feel you are and what other people perceive you as, which means gender roles, behavior, dress code, and so on. So what's been done in the Western countries is that young people who, for some reason or another, are being taken to undergo transition with puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgery, and so on. If you look at studies regarding this group, a lot of people actually, if they don't undergo treatment, turn out to be homosexual. So this means, and if you look at the guidebooks also to like parents of trans children in the US, they explain it as, you might think that your son or daughter is gay, but don't worry, the inner mismatch is not about sexuality, it's about gender. So it means that strands of this treatment actually could be seen as the new gay conversion treatment, where you take people who don't conform to more and more narrow stereotypes of gender and convert them from homosexuals to heterosexuals.
Yeah.
As they say in the guidebooks, they say, for example, well, instead of having a gender non-conforming boy, you have a gender conforming girl.
Yeah. So it's a massive implication. So it will be more and more difficult to be homosexual or lesbian, gay or lesbian, under this definition, and more and more pressure to think that you ought to change your sex. Yeah, really negative. How about young people? You sort of talk about young people as well?
Yes, well, one chapter in my book is about medical transition and the consequences that it has, and the fact that our governments and our hospitals are sending young people into a treatment that's highly experimental, or not even experimental, because as one parent of a trans child told me, an experiment is when you try something out, you take notes and you try to analyze the outcome. Whereas here it's being done without nobody taking notes, basically. So we don't even have a follow-up of these people. Like one of the consequences of the Dutch protocol, which is puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and genital surgery at 18, is infertility. So I spoke to one doctor, a fertility doctor, who came to me because he just didn't know who to talk to. And he heard that I wrote something on the topic. So he came to me and said, I don't know who to tell this to, but I'm having increasingly a new group of patients, which are women in their 20s, coming to me because they're unable to have children. And when I examine them, I see that, their ovaries are dead practically, Yeah. So they're not going to be able to ever have children.
Is that because of the testosterone?
Yeah. When he asks them how is there an explanation for this? It's so unusual. They explain that they have been through puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
Yeah. Yeah, that's terrible. What about because we heard that's in Sweden, cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers are banned now. Recently, in the last few months, they've been banned for under 18s. Is that just sort of legislation, but it's actually still going on, or is it actually banned?
No, it's just one hospital. It's not even a law. It's just one hospital. And that was actually the hospital that was most aggressive in their treatments. Like
Yeah.
practically you could just go there and you could just say, well, I'm actually a boy. And all of a sudden, they would put you on hormones. It wasn't like they really examined whether you did have gender dysphoria or not. It was very affirmative, in their approach. So they themselves decided to stop treatment for under 18s. Now, there are other hospitals in other regions that still go on, but this was a big victory because it was the most aggressive hospital. Everybody knew that if you moved to Stockholm, you could get treatment there.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what's happening in Sweden at the moment? That's also really interesting for our FQT audience. There's normally about 300 to 400 attendees on these webinars from all over the world, normally between 40 and 50 countries. So they'd be really interested to hear what's happening in Sweden with the legislation and the, culture. What are people thinking at the moment?
Our women's movement has been quite slow to pick up on this issue. We're not as forward as in Great Britain or in Spain, for example, where, there have been numerous organizations formed around this issue. Like in Sweden, there has been this idea in the women's movement and in society at large, like, oh, what is the problem? Like, isn't it just about being tolerant? Why, are you bad? But like, they just don't understand. And when I wrote my book, I was having this dilemma because half the people think, oh, you're just a transphobe, like you just basically hate trans people. The other half said, what do you mean? Like, what is this? Like, we have never heard about this. Like, what are you talking about? You can't say woman anymore. They say woman all the time. Like, we don't understand. So basically, there was no audience that really was receptive and understood what is it that I'm talking about. Like, people who are sympathetic think it's just not a problem. So, but because I think of this hospital's decision to ban now treatments for minors, and we've also had some other issues in our country that I think are starting to make people realize what is going on. And slowly the women's movement is forming around the issue.
Yeah.
So, but we have a consensus culture in our country. It's not as easy as, for the Spanish women or the UK women to take up this fight, because basically it means that you will have a split within the feminist movement now. And it's very clear, that some people are on one side, some people are on the other side, and most people are in the middle and kind of don't know and I just want to be a nice person kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, what about the journalists, the mainstream press? Are they very much sort of pro-transgendering and pro-gender ideology and taking on that new definition?
Yeah, I would say that our journalists have not been alerted to, possible other ways of thinking about it or possible consequences of thinking about it. Our journalists are very much, for example, conforming to the standard use now of pronouns. Like we've had about 5 or 6 or so men, criminals who have either murdered their ex-girlfriends or one was charged with child pornography and, some of these things, and they're referred to in the media as women, even when they committed a crime pre-transition. So they were, according to their passport and according to everything, they were men at the time when they committed the crime. But, if they just decide they are women, all of a sudden they're referred to as women in the press. So this is a big problem. And we're having now the self-ID law is going to be voted on, I think, not now, but maybe after next election, perhaps. We don't really know when that's coming up, but there's been a proposal about self-ID.
And you heard, I'm sure, about Spain and Germany, both of their parliaments rejecting self-ID last week. So that's good, but both of our country contacts in those countries say that the legislation proposals will be coming back again in the next few months. So whilst they have, they think, whilst we've sort of not got self-ID in those countries yet. It looks like they're going to be continuing to try.
Yeah. I mean, in our countries, that was not even like it wasn't even written about in the press. I think the general Swedish public don't know what self-ID is, don't know that it's been voted on in other countries, don't know that it's going to be voted on here.
Yeah. And do you have the thing that, you know, in Britain, we've had sort of a lot of the institutions like the health service and the education service are promoting this switch of the definition of sex to gender, and this obfuscation, the conflation of the two, but then using the definition gender and gender identity. That's been happening outside the law, so they've just been promoting it, and there are a lot of legal cases in Britain fighting back. Do you have that? Do you have your...
Oh yes, I mean, there was this thing, I wrote about it in my book. I mean, and after that, like it came out that people started like looking at the website of our official national healthcare online service, where it says woman, avoid the term. And that's what it says. Avoid. And it says do not use sex to describe the way that bodies look like.
Wow, that's
says, well, usually it can be reduced to body parts such as uterus and so on and so on. So, you know, when that came out, people started, you know, posting it online, and even our former foreign minister, Margaret Wallström, tweeted about it. She said, can this be true that they're recommending not to use the word woman? You know, so I think now people are starting to say, oh, what is going on here? I don't think anybody found that page, because basically that's for medical health practitioners themselves on what word to use. I think general public wouldn't even enter that site.